The spirit of this world is a spiritual essence that is permeated by a self-consciousness which knows itself, and knows the essence as an actuality confronting it. But the existence of this world as also the actuality of self-consciousness rests on the process in which the latter divests itself of its personality, thereby creating its world. This world it looks on as something alien, a world therefore of which it must now take possession. But the renunciation of its being for self is itself the product of the actual world. And by this renunciation, therefore, self-consciousness directly takes possession of this world. Or we may say that self-consciousness is merely a something. It has actuality only insofar as it alienates itself from itself. By so doing, it gives itself the character of a universal, and this its universality is its authentication and actuality. This equality with everyone is therefore not the equality of the sphere of legal right, not that immediate recognition and validity of self-consciousness simply because it is. On the contrary, to be valid, it must have conformed itself to the universal by the mediating process of alienation. The non-spiritual universality of the sphere of legal right accepts every natural form of character as well as of existence and justifies them. The universality which counts here, however, is one that has made itself what it is and for that reason is actual. Hegel begins this new section, Culture and its Realm of Actuality, Bildung and Wirklichkeit, in paragraph 488 with a lot of rather abstract ways of talking about things. He says, the spirit of this world, what is this world? The spirit of this higher world is a spiritual essence that is permeated by a self-consciousness which knows itself and knows the essence as an actuality confronting it. And that's kind of a nice wrap-up. And that's actually not going to be that important at this point. I would say that the second sentence is much more important. He says, the existence of this world as also the actuality, the Wirklichkeit, the determinacy of self-consciousness rests on a process in which self-consciousness divests itself of its personality. Of, you might say, it's, as we're going to see in paragraphs yet to come, its purely naturalness, of its idiosyncrasies. There is a sort of disciplining of the self in self-consciousness that is taking place here. And that's part of Bildung, of culture. So what is Hegel sketching out here for us? Now we get to the stuff that's really much more important. He talks about a double movement taking place that involves a sort of renunciation of oneself or aspects of oneself, and that allows at the same time a taking possession that self-consciousness is after. That's one side of the movement. It's already doubled there. The other side of the movement is that a world is being projected or constructed to which self-consciousness is subordinating itself in order to take something back from it. So it almost reads as if this is a sort of projective process in which self-consciousness is making for itself its understanding of the world that it inhabits. Because obviously it exists in a world of others. But it constructs the world that it finds itself in, at least insofar as it understands that world, and can then thereby see it as something to which it must sacrifice aspects of itself in order to gain something in the process. So these two sides go together. Let's look now at what Hegel actually says here. So he says, the world it looks on as something alien, a world, therefore, of which it must now take possession. right? But the renunciation of its being for self is itself the product of the actual world, and by this renunciation, self-consciousness directly takes possession of the world. So it looks like it's losing something, namely its being for self. What is its being for self? Its capacity to judge itself, to say what it is. It is allowing the world to say that for it. But in doing so, it gains a place. It has a seat at the table, as we say. It's earned a certain right. And we see this playing itself out so many times. I'll give you an example, and I don't want to take us too far off course because I do want to come back to the text. But think about when you begin a job, particularly a job that many, many other people work at and have worked at and probably will work at after you leave that job. So, for example, I worked on a machine called a blaster in a factory making aluminum die-cast cam covers, oil pans, and other car parts back when I was in college. And when you go into a place like that, you have to, you learn what the routines are. You learn what the order of the world is, right? So, for example, again, just from my own personal experience, one of the very first things that we would do is go through these giant barrels full of gloves every shift because you wanted to have a couple good gloves because otherwise your hands were going to get torn to ribbons by the pieces that you were working with, these pieces of metal, right? And I learned that lesson very quickly. You need several pairs of gloves. And you better find ones that really fit your hands well. So, you can try to be unique or do your own thing. And in situations like that, it's not going to work out for you if you're doing your own thing. You really need to, as we say, get with the program. Once you do that, that opens up doors for you. That opens up possibilities for you. You start to understand, in this case, the workings of the process that you're involved with. You gain the capacity to get in the right rhythm. I mean, we could go on, and there's many, many other kinds of examples of Bildung or culture that would fit in here. So he goes on and he says, here we go. We may also say that self-consciousness is merely a something, or it has actuality, only insofar as it alienates itself from itself. It becomes other to itself. It allows itself to be made into a thing, precisely so it can have that world for itself. Now, Hegel here is going to talk about this as a process of realizing a universal, of making oneself into a universal, and he's going to contrast this with what is just gone on in the section on legal right. So he says, in so doing, it gives itself the character of a universal. Again, if we want to use this factory worker example, you're no longer just Joe Schmo who came in last week and is kind of clumsy on the blaster. You're now effectively, in a particular sense, a cog in the machine, right? You're one part of the vast working of the factory, but you're also the worker. You are the one making the blaster do what it ought to do. And we could come up with all sorts of other examples that could perhaps tie in with things that we consider closer to culture than industrial processes. When we do that sort of thing, we're occupying the role of a universal. Let's think for an example of the case of being a professor, right? Now, it's interesting. In the old days, when people were more formal, I suppose you could say this was kind of a uniform, although this would be a little bit jaunty, right? Black and red thing, and then the jacket and stuff like that, right? It was kind of a uniform for not just academic work, but people who were dressy in general, right? People would wear jacket and tie to go have dinner, to go to a movie theater, to go fly on an airplane. Even people in lower middle class would do that sort of thing. Now it's got a different connotation. And, you could ask yourself, well, why don't you just be like those other professors who, wear a polo shirt or, wear a T-shirt or dress like a hipster for their students? And we could say, well, there's a different kind of universal there, isn't it? But it's all really the same sort of thing. You can be expressing yourself and all that wonderful stuff, but for the most part, you're really acting in a role. You're just wearing a different kind of uniform. Right? That's why hipsterism is kind of a diminishing return, at least from what we're talking about here. So Hegel says its universality is its authentication in actuality. Now here he talks about equality. He says, this equality with everyone is therefore not the equality of the sphere of legal right, not that immediate recognition and validity of self-consciousness simply because it is. Legal right gives everybody the same status as equally alienated because they are. Oh, you got to, fog a mirror or be human or perhaps occupy a certain social role, right? With this, Hegel says, here what's different is the person is making him or herself. That is what is giving them this equality. He says, the non-spiritual universality of the sphere of legal right accepts every natural form of character as well as existence and justifies them. They're all fine. You want to be that way, you want to be that way, you want to be that way. That's all fine. We'll just treat you all the same. Here he says the universality which counts here is one that he has made. Is one that has made itself what it is, and for that reason is actual, not just formal, not just ideal, but actual. There's a process of self-making taking place here. It is, therefore, through culture that the individual acquires standing in actuality. His true original nature and substance is the alienation of himself as spirit from his natural being. This externalization is therefore both the purpose and the existence of the individual. It is at once the means, or the transition, both of the mere thought form of substance into actuality, and conversely of the specific individuality into essentiality. This individuality molds itself by culture into what it intrinsically is, and only by so doing is it an intrinsic being that has an actual existence. The measure of its culture is the measure of its actuality and power. Although here the self knows itself as this self, yet its actuality consists solely in the setting aside of its natural self. Consequently, the originally specific nature is reduced to the unessential difference of quantity to a greater or lesser energy of will. But the purpose and content of the will belong solely to the universal substance itself and can only be a universal. The particularity of a nature which becomes purpose and content is something powerless and unreal. It is a kind of being which vainly and ridiculously strains every nerve to get going. It is the contradiction of giving to what is particular in actuality, which is immediately a universal. If therefore individuality is erroneously supposed to be rooted in the particularity of nature and character, then in the actual world there are no individualities and no characters, but everyone is like everyone else. But this presumed individuality really only exists in someone's mind, an imaginary existence which has no abiding place in this world, where only that which externalizes itself and therefore only the universal obtains an actual existence. That is why such an imagined existence is esteemed for what it is, for a kind of being. Kind is not quite the same as espèce, the most horrid of all nicknames, for it denotes mediocrity and expresses the highest degree of contempt. Kind and good of its kind are, however, German expressions which add an air of honesty to the meaning, as if it were not really meant so badly. Or again, consciousness is, in fact, not yet aware what kind and what culture and reality are. Paragraph 489 is a very interesting passage. There's a lot going on here that we want to unpack. Much of it is sort of at the level of the text. We don't have to dive too deep, and I don't even think we need to come up with too many examples at this point in order to grasp what he's saying. And there's really two movements in this paragraph. There's an initial movement where we're talking about, how the individual essentially, I'm going to use just the cognate here, builds himself. Miller has molds him or herself through culture, right? The culturing is the molding. We'll get to that in a moment. And then the second part is about how people, you might say, insist too much on their particularity and find that it just kind of slips away, that it doesn't mean all that much, that, hey, we're all unique, we're all, makers or DIY people or artists or whatever you like, right? And none of it means anything. So what we've really got here are two different understandings of the human being that Hegel is not actually disentangling from each other, but which we can identify here in this passage. So let's take a look at what the text is telling us. So he says, it's through culture, through Bildung, that the individual acquires standing and actuality, through this process of making oneself into a universal. Now notice what he's going to say here. This is really, really interesting. His true original nature, the ursprüngliche Natur, and substance is the alienation of himself as spirit from what? From his natural being, natürliche Seins. So we have two different senses of nature here, right? Nature's being used in two different ways. Original nature, natural being. Our natural being is the stuff that we typically think of as our nature, the particularities. And our original nature is something that we have to work to bring out. It's not something there on the surface. So if I say, for example, I'm an irascible person, which is true, thinking back over my history, it's the reason why I'm so interested in researching anger in the first place, finding remedies in philosophy. Maybe that's not what my true nature is. Maybe my true nature is what I am at the process after I've learned to understand and manage and lessen and turn to better uses that irascibility. I've already given you one example right there. I didn't mean to give examples, but let's go on. So he says, this externalization is therefore both the purpose and the existence of the individual. It is at once the means or the transition, both of the mere thought form of substance into actuality, and conversely of the specific individuality into essentiality. So what's going on here? The individual does not find who or what she really is at the core, he or she, by looking merely at their natural being. Not, for example, gender, he or she. Look down. What genitals do you have? Oh, there's your destiny. No, it depends so much on what you make of them or of anything else that you've been endowed with, right? This is where so many kids go bad, by the way. Not in terms of sexuality, but in terms of intelligence, especially smart kids. They have a certain facility. They get some tests that tell them that they're in the 95th percentile. They have teachers telling them that they're brilliant. And they are brilliant for 5th graders or 12th graders. And then they get into much more difficult situations where they needed to grow, they needed to develop, they needed to subordinate themselves, they needed to engage in some, what Hegel is calling alienation and externalization here. Or, another way of talking about it is the Bildung, the culturing, the forming and shaping of oneself, the transitioning from mere particularity into essentiality or universality, and they don't do it. And it's tough for them. And they're living in their glory days the rest of their life. They're unable to conform themselves to learn something more. So the talent that they have goes to waste. So he goes on and he says, this individuality molds itself by culture into what it intrinsically is. Now, I've put the German for that on the board here because the German is actually much more direct. The individual bildet sich zu dem, was sie an sich ist. Literally, it shapes, forms, it builds itself, it cultures itself. It doesn't do so by means of culture. That is the culturing. It cultures itself into what? Zu dem, was sie an sich ist. What it is in itself. So the in itself here is not just something that you're born with or that you have as a brute fact. The in itself is what you make of yourself, what you become, what you reveal within yourself through the process of engaging in culture or self-disciplining. And notice that this is not just somebody else coming along and imposing it on you, making you jump through the hoops, as we say, imposing a lot of exercises. At a certain point, one takes ownership over it and realizes that this is actually for one's own good to develop as the person one is. So Hegel goes on and he says, okay, here we go. The individuality molds itself by culture into what it intrinsically is. Only by so doing is it an intrinsic being that has an actual existence. This is a beautiful phrase right here. The measure of its culture is the measure of its actuality and power. Insofar as it has engaged in culture to that degree, it has actuality, Wirklichkeit, and power, Macht. The capacity to do something in the world. Okay, so that is the first part. Now, notice what Hegel is going to say after this. He says, here the self knows itself as this self, yet its actuality consists solely in the setting aside of its natural self, bringing that to a close. Consequently, the originally specific nature is reduced to the unessential difference of quantity, to a greater or lesser energy of will. But the purpose and content of the will belongs solely to the universal substance itself and can only be a universal. When we talk about the will, we're already universalizing to a certain degree. But we are talking about the particular individual. So what else is going to be said here? He says, and here and now we're going to have a long discussion of how things are going wrong for it. The particularity of a nature which becomes purpose and content is something powerless and unreal. Unreal and powerless by comparison to this universal, right? It is a kind of being which vainly and ridiculously strains every nerve to get going. It is the contradiction of giving to what is particular an actuality which is immediately a universal. Again, to use examples, let me use one from artistry, and we'll talk about, say, the musical arts. There's so many unfortunate people who are told that they are geniuses and so creative and all of that, and they don't want to learn proper technique because technique is boring. Technique is like what everybody else is doing. It's a universal, right? I'm going to do my own thing, man. I'm going to be original. And then their originality sounds pretty much like everybody else's. Or it just sounds crappy. And then they wonder why they're not making any progress as musicians. So you say, I don't know, are you doing exercises? Are you playing scales? Are you playing other people's songs? No, man, I don't want to, influence my way of seeing things and hearing things. I got to be who I am. Well, when you're first developing, you have no idea who the hell you are. You discover that by subordinating yourself through culture, through discipline, to the universal. That's what frees you up. This insistence on particularity, or we say uniqueness, it's really a trap. So he says, what we've got here, if individuality is erroneously supposed to be rooted in the particularity of nature and character, now notice what he says here, very interesting. Then in the actual world, the Wirkliche Welt, there are no individualities and no characters. Everybody's like everybody else. This presumed individuality really exists only in someone's mind. It's a figment of one's imagination. It's a conceit. He says, it has an imaginary existence which has no abiding place in this world, where only that which externalizes itself and therefore only the universal obtains an actual existence. Now, in this world, you can mediate that in many ways. You can do your imagining through social media. You can do your imagining through a MySpace page. You can do your imagining through, creating all sorts of interesting sites. But unless you're actually externalizing something that requires your subordination of your own particularity, your individuality, to something greater than just yourself and your own will to be different, it has no actuality. It has no depth. It has no weight. It doesn't last. So he goes on, and he's going to get very biting. He says, that is why such an imagined existence is esteemed for what it is, for a kind of being. Kind is not quite the same thing as espèce, the most horrid of all nicknames, for it denotes mediocrity and expresses the highest degree of contempt. He's getting this, Miller tells us, from Diderot's Rameau's nephew, right? Which we can talk about much later on. He says, kind and good of its kind are, however, German expressions which add an air of honesty to the meaning as if it were not really meant so badly. Or again, consciousness is, in fact, not yet aware of what kind and what culture and reality are. Hegel is saying that if you're just a kind of thing, that you're not much of anything at all. Now, there's a difference between being a kind of thing and being the universal. How does that play out? Well, we have to go a little bit further to find that out.